All right. Well, once again, thank you everybody for joining us. It is 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. If you have questions, just a reminder, if you just joined, to put those in the questions. You use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And of course, at the top of your screen, you can choose your screen ratio to fit to screen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the chairman of our board, the Plano Chamber Board, Steve McSwain.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Steve McSwain with Arta Travel, the current board chair for the Plano Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're looking forward to hearing from our esteemed guests as much as I am on a very exciting and very timely topic. The growth we've seen here locally and across our country in the past decade impacts our communities in many ways. One of those is the process of redistricting, very important. This is a complex effort that impacts us at every level of government. And today, we're honored to have Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune, along with 3 Collin County mayors also joining us to discuss this important topic. But before we get to that, I would like to recognize our elected officials and Plano Chamber board members that are in attendance today. We appreciate your support and leadership to the Plano business community. I'm fortunate to work with an outstanding board of directors for our 5-star accredited Plano Chamber of Commerce. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Collin County Votes, which is a program from Collin County Business Alliance for which the Chamber is a partner. And here with us to represent Collin County Votes and introduce our speaker is Barbara Baffer, board member of the CCBA. Barbara?
Barbara, you're muted.
Thank you for having me today. My name is Barbara Baffer, and I'm Vice President of Government and Industry Relations for Erickson, which is in Plano. And I'm also a board member on the Collin County Business Alliance. On behalf of the Collin County Business Alliance and its board, I'd like to really welcome all of you to this very important conversation on redistricting. In 2019, Collin County Business Alliance joined forces with various Collin County cities to elevate our collective efforts on the area of the census. CCBA's roles as convener was very important because it brought together stakeholders, cities, businesses in the area to spread awareness around the 2020 census. I'm really proud to say that Collin County had a good response rate to the census of 73%, as compared to 62% for Texas and 67% for the nation. It was also among the highest among the 4 most populous counties in North Texas, followed by Denton, Tarrant, and Dallas counties, respectively. And close to 70% of responders in Collin County leveraged the internet for the first time to respond. Not only is the census data valuable for businesses to make better decisions on strategic initiatives like hiring, expansions, relocations, and economic opportunities for our communities, but it also drives how congressional seats are apportioned and political redistricting, and how state and federal dollars are spent. So today I'm excited to hear from a great set of speakers on how the local impact of redistricting and how our leaders are thinking about it in their communities. Now it's my honor to introduce Ross Ramsey. He's the first speaker we'll have today. And a little bit of background on Mr. Ramsey. He's the executive editor and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, the only member-supported digital-first nonpartisan media organization that informs Texas and engages with them about public policy, government, and statewide issues. He writes regular columns, you've probably read them, on politics, government, and public policy. And before joining the Tribune, he was the editor and co-owner of the Texas Weekly. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Ross Ramsey. Ross?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Nice introduction. Thanks. Thanks for having me this morning. It's good to be back. It's not great to be back at the legislature. I was hoping they would be gone after Memorial Day, but this is the way things go. You know that the census was delayed this year by COVID, and because the census was delayed, the numbers were delayed. And so the legislature that normally would have taken up redistricting sometime in April is instead taking it up on Monday. You know, you'll get local versions of this from your county commissioners and from others as they redistrict. But next week, the Texas legislature will start drawing political lines for the Texas congressional delegation, which, because of the state's growth, is going to have 2 more members in the next elections: the state Senate, the state House, and the state Board of Education. It's really contentious. It's one of the most political things the legislature does. They are in a particularly bad mood right now after a summer with 2 special sessions, a Democratic walkout, and consideration of a bunch of legislation that was divided along partisan lines. So you sort of set the table for a fight with a fight. They're coming in a little bit rough condition, but we'll see how they go. I think there's a reasonable chance that they could get this done in one session, which can last up to 30 days. I think they'll certainly do it in 2 sessions. And, when the 3rd session starts, you can just discount my predictions. A couple of things that we know are going to happen procedurally are that the legislature will draw these maps, and because they're late, there's a pretty good chance that next year's elections will be late. On the normal calendar, March 1st would be the primaries for the Republicans and the Democrats, and candidates would sign up to run for office between mid-November and mid-December. If redistricting is late, you can't run an election without a map, so you push back the filing, and if you push back the filing, you push back the primary, and that pushes back the runoffs that inevitably come after a primary. So you could have a situation like the one in which, Ted Cruz was first elected. If you remember that election, then Dallas Mayor Tom Leppert, former football player Craig James, and Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst were all running for U.S. Senate against this guy who'd never been on a ballot before named Ted Cruz, who was Solicitor General in Greg Abbott's Attorney General's office. And David Dewhurst was the preemptive favorite in that race, but the election got delayed. Ted Cruz had time to get some traction and to raise some money and turned it into an upset victory. So a delay in an election can really do wonders for a challenger and really do damage to an incumbent. It's one of the things to watch ahead. 2 things stuck out at me from the census this time that lead into redistricting. One of them is that a little bit more than 60% of the people in Texas are people of color. Non-Hispanic whites or Anglos make up 39.8% of the total population. Latinos make up 39.4%. They're going to outrun Anglos here pretty quickly. Black Texans account for 12 or 13%, Asian Texans for 6 or 7%, and the rest are mixed or miscellaneous or smaller groups. So the state is not a majority state. It's one of the first plurality states, and the plurality is just, very, very close. We're basically about as many Anglos as Hispanics in Texas. So it's going to be interesting. One of the things that's going to happen is that you're going to fuzz up those lines where people used to say, look, we're not drawing lines on the basis of race, we're drawing lines on the basis of how people vote. It's getting harder and harder to do. And Republicans are finding that they're having some success, but they're really having to change their ways a little bit and play for Hispanic votes in particular, and for Black votes and Asian votes in ways that they haven't in the past. So that's one change that I think is going to be really evident in these maps. And if you think about the way people live now, there's kind of, if you're trying to draw a map that finds the Republicans and finds the Democrats and puts them into distinct districts, given the state of software and information, it's pretty easy to go household by household in most parts of the state and say, this is probably a Republican household, they vote in Republican primaries. This is probably a Democratic household, they vote in Democratic primaries. But it's not necessarily this is a Democratic neighborhood, and it's sort of house by house. And so you're going to see maps that look like they're picking their way through a jar of red and blue and green M&Ms and trying to pick up all the red ones over here and all of the blue ones over there. It's going to be a very interesting and technical redistricting map. It also means that when you look at Collin County, urban counties and suburban counties that are pretty well populated, Collins, the Dentons, the Tarrants, the Dallases, you're going to see a lot more squiggly lines in a lot of places, and a lot of lines where somebody draws a line up a street, skips 2 houses, and then continues on the line. So there's going to be a very interesting deal. I expect to see the first maps pretty quickly next week, and we'll sort of go from there. The other thing that we saw in the census is that Texas, before you get to partisan redistricting and talking about race and all of those things, you have to talk about geography. Texas population is more and more concentrated in a triangle that has Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex at the top, Austin, San Antonio corner, San Antonio corridor on one corner and Houston and the suburbs around that on the other corner. In fact, if you break this up, 80% of the population of the state is in just 31 counties. Just over 50% is in just 7 counties. So our concentrations are getting really, really strong. And then if you look at the last elections, you see that 14 of the 20 most populated counties in the state voted in 2020 for Joe Biden for president. So the Republicans have all of the advantages here, but drawing the maps is going to be a little bit tricky. Let's talk about their advantages for a minute. They have legislative majorities in the House and the Senate. They did very well in Texas elections in 2020 and came strong into a year where they're going to draw maps that'll be used with some amendments along the way for the next 10 years. So they have a chance to continue to keep the institution of a Republican majority in place. The Republicans have held the Senate since the late 90s. They've held the House since the early part of this century, and they don't show any signs of losing that. But they've got a difficult map to draw. So, we'll kind of see how it goes from there. And they're drawing in these counties where, there's a long time analogy for Texas politics where you look at a map the day after the election and it looks like a big Texas shaped bowl of tomato soup with some big blueberries in it. And the blueberries are increasingly where the population is. Though Biden won in some of those big counties and in some suburban counties where Republicans expect to win or have expected to win historically, it's still true that this is a Republican state. It's just a little bit less red than it was before. A couple of things going into this next election that bode well for the Republicans are that it's a midterm election for a Democratic president. The party of an incumbent president typically does poorly in a midterm election. Donald Trump his party had a tough time in 2018. Barack Obama's party had a very tough time in 2010. You remember the Tea Party election. It kind of goes like that. That is the turf. So we start with a Democratic president's midterm election. We have a Republican legislature right now drawing the political maps that will be used in the 2022 election, and one would expect, without being cynical or anything like that, that's going to be a Republican map that's going to be drawn to keep the Republican majority in place in some form. So that's an advantage. And the other one is that we've got an incumbent governor who doesn't have an opponent. The turnout in an election is usually driven by the top race. And, if you remember the 2018 election, there was a heck of a race between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. And it ended up being under 5 points, but it drove turnout way up. And it's generally true. It's not exactly, point by point true, but it's generally true in Texas that this is a red state, and the more people who vote, the less red it is. It hasn't actually become a blue state. Biden did lose that election in 2020, but when our turnouts are big, Republicans have closer races than when our turnouts are small. We've had a couple of elections where down ballot Republicans really had to campaign to win, and in cases where they had Democratic opponents. The race at the top drives the turnout, and Greg Abbott doesn't have a Democratic opponent at this point. So there's not really much to talk about. There's not the kind of race at the top of the ballot that gets people who don't pay day-to-day, minute-to-minute attention to politics involved. So unless Beto shows up or he says, I'm not going to run, and some other Democrats get in, this may be a cakewalk for the Republicans. So that's kind of the setting as we go into redistricting. If you think about that population compacting into that triangle, and you think about our bowl of soup for a minute, the candidates, the incumbents in rural parts of the state, in West Texas and in East Texas and some parts of South Texas, are going to have to come into the triangle or much closer to the triangle in order to find the voters they need to bring their districts up to the right size. A quick example is the Texas Senate. There are 31 seats in the Texas Senate. There's 29.1 million people in Texas. You divide the big number by the number of seats, and you have to have, with a little bit of variance, that number of people in each one of the Senate districts. So one of the first analyses we do is we look at it and say, which districts are overpopulated, which districts are underpopulated. The overpopulated districts are going to have to lose people, which probably means you're going to tighten their geography a little bit. the underpopulated places are going to have to gain more real estate and more people with it to get up to the number that they need. If you're in West Texas, if you're in the state Senate and your name is Kel Seliger or Charles Perry or Don Buckingham, you're going to have to find people. Those districts are smaller in population than they need to be. They need to get bigger. And there's a prospect of all those West Texas senators sitting and looking at one another and saying, who's going home? So that the rest of us can, cannibalize your district to get enough voters that we don't have to go into Dallas, Fort Worth. We don't have to go into Austin and San Antonio to get our voters. So, that's the first cut, is those people are going to be looking for voters. If you look at Collin County, the numbers are really interesting here because most of the Collin County districts are overpopulated. They have more people than they need. And so those are going to shrink a little bit. In the House, the winner of this parade is Holland, whose district, which includes Rockwall and kind of scoops up over the top of Collin County, has 39% too many people. So that district's going to shrink. It might shrink toward Collin County. It might be that you can give up a lot of Rockwall. We'll just see how they draw the lines. Sanford's district is overpopulated. Noble's district is overpopulated. Leach's district is overpopulated. Matt Shaheen's district is a little bit short. So some of the people that the other members of the Collin County delegation, or the other districts in Collin County get rid of, could end up in the Shaheen district. In the Senate, both Paxton and Springer are overpopulated. So those districts are going to have to shrink a little bit. I think they'll both be in Collin County. It's just a matter of, how they shrink and where they shrink. Van Taylor's district is overpopulated. So is Pat Fallon's. And Fallon's is interesting because it includes part of Collin County, but it goes into East Texas. And if you're drawing those maps in your Pat Fallon, you might want to keep, one place over another place. Members of Congress have a little bit of an interesting problem when they get in the Texas legislature. House members care a lot about how the House districts look. Senators care a lot about how the Senate districts look. And both the House and the Senate members like to torture members of Congress a little bit. They only see them once every 10 years. They're not particularly beholden to them. And that's an interesting game of poker that takes place. Two things to watch as you're watching redistricting is who's going to quit. Because if you quit, your district is open and people can jump into it without hurting an incumbent. They don't have to go after a friend. For example, in my Senate example, Don Buckingham has a district that goes from Lake Travis on the western end of Travis County, where Austin is, all the way up to Abilene. And she wants to run for Texas Land Commissioner. So suddenly you've got all of that real estate available to those West Texas senators who need population. And so they can move toward the east and maybe get the population that they need without going into the cities and getting into a whole different kind of politics than they're in right now. There's also, some local things that go on, and you'll see this as you watch the legislature draw Collin County and as you lobby the legislature or talk to them about what the maps ought to look like. One of the things you're supposed to pay attention to in redistricting is what they call communities of interest. This can be anything from a neighborhood that's particularly well-connected and considered kind of a whole piece. It could be the community around a high school. It could be any number of things. In a place like Collin County, it might be this city and that city, have different personalities and don't want to get their interests split and shared any more than they have to be. So one of the things that's getting traded in West Texas, which again is just a really good example of this, is you've got a district where Amarillo is sort of king of the hill. You've got a district where Lubbock is kind of king of the hill. You've got a couple of districts that split Abilene. Midland is in a district with Amarillo, and some of the Midlanders don't like that. You get some interesting things like that. So you get, when you have to pair cities, sometimes that's as contentious as putting two incumbents in the same district. So that'll be one of the things to watch. And on a local level, you'll be watching it and say, I don't see how they can put that high school in the same districts with that high school, or whatever it is, this suburb with that suburb, this company split from that company. All of those kinds of things come into play here. I want to talk about the legislature's mood a little bit more. The walkouts this summer, when the Democrats went to Washington, D.C. to try to block consideration for a while of the voting and election bill that Governor Abbott wanted and has now signed in the third special session, it had the effect, or one of the effects that it had, was that it unified the Republicans. They were unified in the House. They were sort of uniformly mad at the Democrats, and now they're holding hands in some ways, in ways that they weren't before. So they come into this special session pretty much unified. The Democrats, when they got out of town, there was some rancor inside the ranks and some fighting among the Democrats, and they actually come to this party not only in the legislative and political minority, but also somewhat divided among themselves. The walkouts, in addition to just the special sessions themselves, put a strain on a lot of legislative relationships. And one of the things I'm going to be watching, and a lot of us are going to be watching down here during the session, is how those relationships hold together and how they don't, as the legislature puts this map together. They've got a couple of things in this third special session that they have to do. Redistricting is a must do. If the legislature doesn't draw the maps, the courts will draw them for them. As much as legislators might disagree with each other, they kind of band together in not wanting the courts to draw the maps. There is $16 billion remaining from the federal COVID relief money, and it's got remarkably few strings for federal money. And the legislature is looking at all kinds of ways to spend that, and they're actually in a pretty good mood about it, because it's mostly nonpartisan things. There's a big push for broadband. There's some push for straight up infrastructure, whether that's water and sewer, whether that's roads, whether that's bridges. There's a lot of conversation about putting money into ailing hospitals. It's one-time money, so it would be mostly capital expenditures as you go through the thing. But you're going to start seeing people bidding for that. You probably, among you, have some people who are bidding for some of that money. So that's item number 2 on the agenda. Those 2 things, they absolutely have to get done. There is a legislative version of the governor's attempt to limit local mandates in COVID responses. That's as neutrally as I can say that. This is everything from masks to social distancing to orders to businesses to change their capacity from 100% to something less. All of those kinds of things. As you know, there's been a lot of tension between the state and local governments about who gets to order those things, and I guess now the state and the national government, about who gets to order things as we go along. So that's another thing that'll be in contention. All of these other things, compete for attention with the main game, which is redistricting and spending that federal money. There's a piece of legislation that didn't get anywhere in either the regular session or either of the 2 earlier special sessions that's back. This would regulate which teams transgender athletes in public schools get to play on. It's something like the bathroom bill, if you remember that from a couple of sessions ago. It's divisive in some of the same ways. It's one of those issues that gets some corporate resistance from companies that generally do their best to stay out of politics. It's been stuck all year. I don't know what's going to happen to it in a special session, but it's on the ticket. And the other one is kind of a wild card. There's an animal cruelty bill, a dogs bill, that was called the dog tethering bill. A bunch of people have been pushing for this for a long time. It's bipartisan, and it's actually sort of an interesting group. It's just basically people who really like dogs, and it's legislation that would make it a crime to tether a dog without shade or food and some other things. The governor vetoed it after it passed the legislature. It was a bit unexpected. It got some immediate social media backlash. And it's one of those things where the governor said he thought that the legislature was trying to micromanage people, overregulate them, but dog lovers sort of rose up against it, and now the governor's put it on the agenda, I suspect, to make the dog lovers happy again and not risk losing the dog vote in the 2022 elections. But that's sort of the shape of the 30-day special session that's ahead, and that's the environment in which they're going to be drawing these redistricting lines. 3 things I want to say about redistricting. One of the places to follow it, there's a legislative agency called the Texas Legislative Council. They actually draw the maps. When legislators say, I want this to kind of look like that. The people that actually wield the crayons are the people over at the Texas Legislative Council. And if you go to that, just Google that and you'll find it. If you go to their website, there's a redistricting section and you can draw your own maps and you can look at maps other people have been drawing, whether those are the ones actually being considered by the House and the Senate, or they're just maps that people have drawn along the way. So that's one thing you should know. You can fiddle with your own maps to sort of see how things go. You can analyze other maps to see why they're maybe doing some of the things they're doing. The second kind of maps are really important to people, to places like Collin County. They're regional maps. Todd Hunter is the House chairman of redistricting. Joan Huffman from Houston is the Senate chairwoman of redistricting. And generally speaking, particularly in the House, they will look to local delegations and say, listen, draw your own map and bring it to us, and we'll plug it into the statewide map. Because Todd Hunter is from Corpus Christi and really doesn't want to get involved in Collin County politics any more than he has to, or Dallas or Tarrant or Denton or any of the big counties around. And the House has a thing called the county line rule, which basically says you can't draw House districts that cross a county line unless there's no more population. So in Collin County right now, there's 5 House members who have all or part of their districts in Collin County. And they basically, 4 of them are completely within Collin County. And the other one is the only one that hopped the line. And it's just because there weren't enough people. That goes down to Rockwall. So when you're drawing these maps, there's more local control over local maps in urban and suburban areas like yours. So that's one of the places where you can weigh in on this. And then there are the statewide maps where basically, we've got at some level, we've got the parties fighting for this or that or the other thing. And those are the maps that are going to be finalized. And then we'll go immediately to court. Last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll pop it open for questions. This will inevitably go to court. The 2010 census led to redistricting, and the litigation over that redistricting set was still going when the 2020 census began. So there's a litigation industry around this. It's going to start up immediately. In fact, a couple of suits have already been filed, even though there's no maps yet. And this will go immediately from the legislature in these special sessions into courts, and we'll be off to the races again. And if we have time here, I think we can take a couple of questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Mr. Ramsey. We have just a few minutes for a little bit of a lightning round of questions, and we got some great questions turned in from our audience. So I'll just jump right in. Do you feel like there's any concerted or realistic effort to take politics out of redistricting?
There's a great line, I don't know who it belongs to, it's probably 300 years old, that you can't take the politics out of politics. This is an essentially political exercise, and it's a fundamental political exercise. And the reason it's so contentious is because this is really about power and how it's wielded over more time than one election. We're fighting over a decade and what might happen over that decade. And, it's unsatisfying to the losers, of course, but it's also sometimes unsatisfying to the winners. And that's just an argument to weigh in, but you can't take the politics out of it. That's essentially and intrinsically political.
Well, thank you. I think this one's on the minds of every Texan, but do you think Matthew McConaughey could make a serious run as an independent?
There's a couple of ifs in that question. Do I think he could make a run? Yes. Do I think he could make a serious run? A little bit less positive, yes. The advantage to getting into a political race, if you're a celebrity or if you're well known, is that the first $5 or $6 million you spend in a political race, particularly a statewide race in a place like Texas, is here's who I am. And then the second $5 million is here's what I'm about. So a McConaughey could come in and say, like a Schwarzenegger did, like a Ronald Reagan did, and say, here's who I am. You already know me. Here's what I'm about. And then they have to basically walk through the coals like everybody else. I'm not sure he's going to run. It's getting late to declare a candidacy. You have to raise a bunch of money to make one of these races. We're not even sure yet. And even after some questioning, whether McConaughey would run as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. So maybe.
Okay. You talked a little bit about it at the top of your of your presentation, but how will the other topics on the special session call impact redistricting and the ability to get it done in a timely fashion?
You know, I think the real truth of redistricting, like a lot of big issues, is the whole legislature is there, but there are only really 10 or 15 people who are like hands-on, sleeves rolled up in redistricting, and the rest of the legislature is free to sort of move on their own issues. I think that federal money is certainly going to get a lot of attention. I actually think the dog bill is going to get a lot of attention because it's a, you know, you can laugh about it, but it's a politically hazardous piece of legislation. And like I said, the governor and everybody else wants to make sure they're not on the wrong side of dogs. So, but I don't think there'll be a lot of involvement. They could get sidetracked on the partisan fights that they've got on those other two issues, on the transgender athletes and on mandates. Those things are so politically loaded, whatever your position is, those are politically loaded fights and contentious ones that could distract from the couple of things that they feel like they have to do.
Do you think Democrats could walk out again?
I think they could. You know, the walkouts years ago, the model walkouts were when the Democrats, you may remember this, 2 redistricting cycles ago, when the Democrats from the House went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, when the Democrats from the Senate went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. You know, when you're in a political minority, ultimately you have to come home, and ultimately you're going to lose because that's the way the math works. But the question is, does your leaving change the game? I don't think the summer leaving changed the game, and I don't think there's a lot of taste among the Democrats to do it again, but you never know. It's politics.
Okay, one final question, and this comes from our audience as well. Is the county rule unique to the Texas House, or is this something that could be proposed for the U.S. House and Texas Senate seats?
It's unique to the Texas House. It started with a race involving Tom Craddock out in Midland County all those years ago. And there's an example of what happens if you don't have a county line rule in Austin. The Republicans drawing the maps 10 years ago wanted to bust up the Democratic stronghold in Austin. So rather than give Travis County one member of Congress who was solidly an Austin member, they instead split up Travis County so that it's in, I believe it's 5 different congressional districts, and it doesn't really control any of them. Mike McCall's district goes from Austin to Houston. I live about 2 miles from the Capitol, and my congressman is Roger Williams from Weatherford. So, you know, they can jump the lines like that. In the case of the Texas House, they can't jump the lines. And so you end up in a case like Collin County's with 4 people who solely represent Collin County in the Texas legislature, and another one who's strongly bound to it, but just Collin County and Rockwall. So can work for you, can work against you.
Well, great. Well, thank you again, Mr. Ramsey, for spending some time with us today and providing your expertise on this topic. I know I learned a few things and have a little more homework to do, so I greatly appreciate you sharing this with our members and our guests.
Thanks for inviting me back. I really appreciate it, and wish you all well.
Absolutely. Well, at this time, I'd like to invite Barbara Baffer back to join us again and introduce the next section of our program, which is a panel discussion with 3 local mayors to discuss the local impact of redistricting in a bit more detail. As we heard, redistricting does impact our community at the local level. So our mayors from Plano, Frisco, and McKinney are here with us today. Ms. Baffer will introduce our 3 mayors and lead them through a series of questions, but please continue to post questions using the question tab at the bottom of your screen. We should have some time at the end of the panel discussion to take a few, and it's a great opportunity to hear from 3 of our best leaders in the area. So Barbara, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. And it's my pleasure to introduce 3 mayors from Collin County. And I think we can all very much appreciate the impact they have on our cities. So as a Frisco resident, I'm pleased that my mayor's here as well. So I'll start by introducing the mayor of Plano. Mayor Muns became Plano's 40th mayor in May of this year. Prior to becoming the mayor, he served his Plano community in many capabilities. His most recent position was the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and prior to that, he served as the Economic Development Board. Mayor Muns has had a big background in education and served on the school board, and he's very passionate about educating Plano's children. And also, he's now a member of the United States Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. Welcome, Mayor Muns. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Mayor of McKinney, George Fuller. George was elected mayor of McKinney in May of 2017. He's a builder and developer of custom homes and commercial properties, and he's some of the most award-winning and decorated homes in North Texas. And Mayor Fuller also received the Builder of the Year award 6 years in a row, and from D Magazine, along with honors from the National Home Builders Association. Welcome, Mayor Fuller. And finally, I'd like to welcome the mayor of Frisco, Jeff Cheney. He's a native Texan, and he was elected mayor of Frisco in 2017 and holds the distinction of being the youngest mayor of Frisco. And I might also add, he probably has the best time in the mile, having gone to the gym class with him. Since Mayor Cheney has taken office, Frisco's been recognized as the fastest growing city in America and the #1 place to live by Money Magazine. Previously, Mayor Cheney served on the Frisco City Council. So thank you again for joining us, mayors. And we have some great questions here for you. And I'll just start with you, Mayor Muns. We heard a lot from Mr. Ramsey about redistricting. What's the #1 ask you have to the Texas legislature about how they go about redistricting?
Well, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Chamber, for inviting the three of us today. We appreciate it. Obviously, I think we heard from Mr. Ramsey how complicated the redistricting can be. It's a tedious process, but it's absolutely worth learning about. And I would love the opportunity for our residents of Plano to really have input in regard to these redistricting lines that are going to be considered. I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen. We'll certainly encourage our legislators to let us be involved, but it is very important how these lines are drawn, because it does affect the city's budget. It affects the public safety, our schools, our school policies. So these are very important to what we do in the city. And so that being said, they're definitely something that we ought to have some input in regard.
Thank you, Mayor Muns. Mayor Fuller, would you like to address that question as well? Mayor Fuller, I think you're on mute, please.
I don't know how much I can really add to that, though. I'd say that I love what John said about how nice it would be to have the have input of our citizens and residents. But the reality is, and I think it was stated kind of earlier, I don't think the politics will ever be taken out of redistricting, and that'll be what drives it. I think for the city of McKinney and many of the cities up here, you know, we certainly don't expect to see, and we won't have a political partisan impact. You know, what we will see, of course, is just additional representation in Austin, and that's great. But as far as the any political landscape, that obviously doesn't appear that it will change anytime soon, certainly in my city.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. Mayor Cheney, we heard from Mr. Ramsey that some of your people in Frisco are living in a 38% overpopulated district, including me. Do you have any comments on population growth and what you've seen as mayor, and what you anticipate in terms of future growth in Collin County?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for having us. It's good to see you mayors again. Yeah, in the last decade, since the last census, Frisco has nearly doubled our population. So a lot of things have changed here for us in the last 10 years. You know, one thing that is specific to Frisco is that we are actually straddled over 2 counties, in Collin County and Denton County, which creates unique challenges when trying to work with regional elected officials at the county level, the state level, and so forth. And so we do hope we have a seat at the table. One of our big asks is, you know, it's already difficult enough working through 2 state representatives, 2 state senators, et cetera, is that all of Collin County, Frisco is in a single district, and that it isn't carved up further where perhaps, you know, or even the Denton County side where we're working with perhaps 3 or even 4 different representatives. It really kind of waters down our voice. And so I think that's our big ask as they can consider the different lines.
Okay. Any of the mayors can answer this. We can start with Mayor Muns. Do you plan on doing any specific advocacy towards redistricting?
We're not particularly. I mean, we're gonna sit down with our legislators and talk about how we can help their discussion in regards to the lines. I think Ross talked about one of our districts is underpopulated and one of them is over. So there will be some adjustment probably to resolve that. But one of the things he said at the very end was the Texas Legislative Council is a good resource for our residents to look at and to give input to. So I think really the main thing that we're going to do is ask that we have a seat at the table possibly, and let our residents chime in and let them know how we feel about it. All three of us are elected nonpartisan, and it's organic to a certain degree. I mean, we're just going for the votes of all of our residents, and it's kind of refreshing to be able to do that, quite frankly. But as Mayor Fuller said, politics are politics, and so we'll do our best to lend a hand, but we may or may not be offered a whole lot.
Thank you. Mayor Cheney or Mayor Fuller, do you have any comment on that?
I have a meeting scheduled next week. I want to thank Jeff Leach, who reached out and asked to get together this coming week to discuss this very subject. So that's one of our legislators in the area that has taken a proactive step. So I'm happy about that. And I've reached out to our other legislators as well. So we'll have the dialogue and the conversation and how much input we have. Again, at the end of the day, there's no doubt in my mind that politics will drive every decision on this. I wish that wasn't necessarily the case. But that aside, again, I really want to publicly thank Jeff for reaching out and wanting to have that dialogue. So I take that in very good faith.
Good.
Yeah, and I'll just echo those sentiments that Mayor Fuller said, is that we'll be proactive in those discussions. Hopefully they lend us an ear and consider the city's perspective. We'll certainly advocate on behalf of our citizens about what's right for Frisco.
Great. And we have a question from the audience here. It's they want to know what is the timeline for this process, this local the local process? Is there any kind of window of that you're looking at?
Tomorrow. No.
I don't know the answer to that. I think we're kind of looking for the answer for that as well, as far as see what special sessions look like and what the timeline looks like. And I think your speaker before even mentioned things may have to go through the court system. So we anticipate it being a little bit of a lengthy process.
Is there a walkout again?
Yeah.
Great. And so to conclude here, any of the mayors, would you like to make a final statement, something you want the Plano Chamber to know and the CCBA? Something top of mind for you?
Well, I'll just start in that, with the Plano Chamber and other surrounding chambers, we love the advocacy that you do on behalf of business owners, and the business owners that are, listening in on this call. They should have their voice heard and let their elected officials, not just at the state level, but also your mayors and city councils, know what's important to you as a business, how redistricting may impact your business, and if there's specific input that they have. We're certainly all ears and appreciative of it.
Yeah, and I want to shout out to I know the Plano Chamber, always very, very engaged. McKinney Chamber, Lisa Hermes, is so ultra and actively engaged at every legislative session, really advocating for businesses in our community, which of course manifests into just advocating for the entire community. So I've seen nothing but that kind of advocacy and engagement by all the chambers in our area. And I know that all of us are tremendously appreciative. I mean, we have a fantastic working relationship and constant communication with our chamber here. And it's an awesome asset.
Mayor Muns?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I I thank the chamber for making this public relations opportunity for not only, as Jeff said, our business community, because they're so important to all of us, but our residents, and making them aware of the issues that are really going to affect them at the end of the day. And so we can't thank you enough for bringing the issues public and making sure we do all we can to make it people aware here in Collin County, and we can't thank you enough.
Great. And just we had another question come in. They ask, what is the #1 issue in each of your cities that you hear from your constituents? Is there something that comes up again and again?
Traffic.
380.
I mean, I think we're all dealing with traffic issues and resolutions, and so that's always a topic of conversation for certainly us in Plano, and I know it is for George and Jeff as well, because the growth is unprecedented, and it happened to us 20 years ago, and obviously it's happening to Frisco and McKinney now. So that will always be top of at the very top.
And it's sobering to look back on some of the thoroughfare maps of Dallas County when they were at our stage, quite frankly, and then to look at where we are and the lack of investment that's been made in the previous decades, which puts us woefully behind and very, very challenged in our thoroughfare plan. So that's probably the #1 thing up here as well.
Yeah, that'd be our #1, but just to give a different answer, certainly taxes are on top of people's mind, especially with rapidly rising property values, and how cities are going to address that in coming years as their appraisals likely reflect what's happening here in the market. And so I'm sure that's the same in the other cities as well.
Great, thank you, Mayor Cheney. Then I think I'm going to turn it back to Kelly. Thank you again, mayors, for these great remarks, and we're also privileged to have you as our mayors in Collin County. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Mayors Muns, Fuller, and Cheney, for your insight and the very informative discussion. I'd like to also say a special thank you to the Collin County Votes Initiative for being our sponsor today, and thank you to Ross Ramsey for his presentation. Redistricting is clearly important to our community and the future of our county. The Plano Chamber, among our partners and friends in the entire DFW region, will be following this third special session and reporting back to you on the state's progress. I hope that each of you enjoyed the conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. I'll just make a quick plug that it's not too late to sign up for our 30th annual golf tournament coming up on Monday, September 27th at Pecan Hollow here in Plano. Even our friends in Frisco and McKinney can join us. So thank you again for all of you for attending, our speakers, our elected officials, and again, our sponsor, Collin County Votes. Have a great day.